The old house creaked under the weight of its years, its warped wooden floors groaning with every gust of wind that slipped through the cracked windows. In the heart of the living room, Ezekiel sat in his wheelchair, his gnarled hands folded over a threadbare blanket. His eyes, once sharp as a hawk's, now clouded with age, traced the familiar outlines of the room. Faded photographs lined the mantel, frozen moments of a life that felt like someone else as a young man with a broad smile. A family gathered around a picnic table, a wife whose laughter still echoed in his dreams. Those days were gone, buried under decades of loss and betrayal. Ezekiel was 82, his body a map of battles fought and lost. A stroke 5 years ago had stolen the strength from his legs, chaining him to the chair that now defined him in the eyes of others. His children, 3 grown adults who once called him Dad with warmth, now spoke to him in clipped tones, their visits rare and strained. The words that haunted him most came from his eldest son, Marcus, spat out during a heated argument 2 years ago. "You're nothing but a cripple, a burden to feed." The phrase had lodged in Ezekiel's heart like a splinter, festering with every sidelong glance, every sigh of inconvenience from his family. The house, once alive with the chaos of raising 3 kids, was now a mausoleum of silence. Ezekiel's wife, Clara, had passed a decade ago, her absence a wound that never healed. The children, Marcus, Lila, and Thomas, had drifted away, their lives consumed by careers, debts, and resentments they never voiced to his face. They came only when they needed something: money, a signature, or to rummage through Clara's old jewelry for something to pawn. Ezekiel endured it all, his silence mistaken for weakness. But Ezekiel was not weak. Beneath the frail exterior, his mind burned with clarity. He remembered every slight, every whispered complaint about the cost of his care. He knew they saw him as a relic, a drain on their inheritance. What they didn't know was that Ezekiel had been planning. For years, he'd been watching, listening, and preparing for the day his voice would be heard one last time. The morning sun barely pierced the heavy curtains as Marcus arrived, his polished shoes clicking impatiently on the floor. At 50, he carried himself like a man who'd conquered the world, though his failing business told a different story. "Dad, we need to talk about the house," he said, barely looking at Ezekiel. "It's too big for you. We're thinking a care facility. It's for your own good." Ezekiel's lips twitched, but he said nothing. Lila arrived next, her perfume sharp and expensive, her face a mask of practiced concern. At 47, she was the diplomat, always smoothing over Marcus's bluntness. "We just want you to be comfortable, Dad," she said, patting his hand like he was a child. Thomas, the youngest at 42, lingered by the door, his eyes darting nervously. He rarely spoke, but Ezekiel knew his silence hid a hunger for the family's dwindling wealth. They sat around the dining table, a relic from happier times, and discussed Ezekiel's future as if he weren't there. A care facility. Sell the house. Split the proceeds. The words swirled around him, each one a blade. Ezekiel gripped the arms of his wheelchair, his knuckles whitening. He'd heard enough. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice low but steady, cutting through their chatter like a thunderclap. They froze, startled by the steel in his tone. Marcus recovered first, his laugh sharp and dismissive. "Dad, be realistic. You can't stay here alone. You're not capable." Ezekiel's eyes locked onto his son's, unyielding. "I've been capable my whole life. Built this house with my hands. Raised you. Buried your mother. Don't tell me what I can't do." The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing against their defenses. For a moment, they saw the man he used to beta one who'd carried them on his shoulders, who'd worked double shifts to keep them fed. But the moment passed, and Marcus's smirk returned. We'll talk later, Marcus said, standing. You're tired. They left without another word, their footsteps echoing in the empty house. Ezekiel stared at the closed door, his heart pounding. They thought they'd won. They thought he was finished. But Ezekiel had one card left to play, one they'd never see coming. That night, he wheeled himself to the study, a small room cluttered with books and memories. He pulled a locked box from a drawer, his fingers trembling as he turned the key. Inside was a document, its pages crisp and final. His will. Not the one his children assumed they knew, the one they'd pestered him about for years. This was different. This was his truth. Ezekiel leaned back, the weight of his decision settling over him. He'd spent a lifetime giving his love, his labor, his dreams. Now, he would take something back. Not for himself, but for the legacy he'd fought for, the values he'd tried to instill in a family that had forgotten him. The will was his final act, a reckoning that would shake them to their core. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Ezekiel closed his eyes, picturing the day they'd gather to hear his last words. He could almost see their faces, Marcus's smug grin, Lila's calculated tears, Thomas's anxious fidgeting. They thought they knew him. They thought they'd outlasted him. But when the will was read, they would be destroyed not by cruelty, but by the truth of who they'd become. The days bled into weeks, each one a quiet battle between Ezekiel's resolve and the growing impatience of his children. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a chessboard, with Ezekiel at its center, moving pieces his children couldn't see. They visited more frequently now, their motives thinly veiled. Marcus brought glossy brochures for nursing homes, each page promising comfort and care in exchange for Ezekiel's independence. Lila dropped hints about her struggling art gallery, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she mentioned family helping family. Thomas, ever the shadow, said little but watched the house with hungry eyes, as if measuring its worth in dollars. Ezekiel played along, nodding at their suggestions, his silence mistaken for surrender. But every night, he returned to the study, rereading the will. It wasn't just a document. It was a mirror, reflecting the choices his children had made. He'd rewritten it a year ago, after Marcus's cruel words had cut too deep. The original will, the one they expected, had divided his modest estate house, savings, a few heirlooms equally among them. But this new version was different. It was a reckoning. He remembered the day he'd changed it. The lawyer, Mr. Hargrove, a gray-haired man with kind eyes, had sat across from him, concern etched into his face. "Are you sure, Ezekiel?" he'd asked. "This will cause waves." Ezekiel had nodded, his jaw tight. "They've made their choices. So have I." The will wasn't about punishment, though it might feel that way to them. It was about truth. Ezekiel had spent his life building something, not just a house, but a legacy of hard work, loyalty, and love. He'd hoped his children would carry it forward, but they'd chosen differently. Marcus chased status, Lila craved control, and Thomas drifted in their wake, too weak to forge his own path. The will would force them to face themselves, to see what they'd traded for their greed. One afternoon, as autumn leaves piled against the house, Lila arrived alone. She sat across from Ezekiel, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Dad," she began, her voice softer than usual, "I know this is hard, but we're worried about you. This house, it's too much. And the cost," she paused, her eyes flickering to the mantel, where Clara's old silver locket rested. "We just want to make things easier." Ezekiel studied her, his heart aching. Lila had been his little girl once, her laughter filling the house as she painted wildflowers on construction paper. Now, her eyes held calculation, not love. "Easier for who?" he asked quietly. Her smile faltered. "For you, Dad. For all of us." She reached for his hand, but he pulled back, the motion slow but deliberate. "I'm not a fool, Lila," he said. "I know what you want. I've always known." She stiffened, her mask slipping. "That's not fair. We're trying to help." But her voice trembled, betraying her. She left soon after, her heels clicking sharply as she fled the weight of his gaze. That night, Ezekiel wheeled himself to the kitchen, a room that still smelled faintly of Clara's baking. He poured a glass of water, his hands steady despite the tremor that sometimes plagued them. He thought of his wife, her strength, her belief in second chances. Clara would have urged him to forgive, to give their children another chance. But Ezekiel had tried. For years, he'd waited for them to see him, to remember the father who'd sacrificed everything. They hadn't. And now, time was running out. The next morning, Marcus called a family meeting. The three siblings gathered in the living room, their voices low but urgent. Ezekiel listened from the hallway, hidden in the shadows. "We can't wait forever," Marcus said, his tone sharp. "The house is worth at least $500,000. Split 3 ways. That's enough to fix everything." "Fix what?" Lila snapped. "Your bad investments. My gallery's fine without your help." "Fine," Marcus scoffed. "You're drowning in debt. And Thomas didn't pretend you're not eyeing that car you can't afford." Thomas mumbled something, his voice too low to catch. Ezekiel's chest tightened. They weren't just planning his future. They were carving up his life like vultures. He wheeled back to his room, his heart heavy but his resolve unbroken. They thought they were in control, but they were wrong. That evening, Ezekiel called Mr. Hargrove. "It's time," he said, his voice steady. "Set the date for the reading." Hargrove hesitated, then agreed. 2 weeks, he said. "I'll make the arrangements." Ezekiel hung up, staring at the photograph of Clara on his nightstand. Her smile was a beacon, guiding him through the storm. He wasn't doing this for revenge. He was doing it for her, for the life they'd built, for the values they'd cherished. His children had forgotten those values, but he would remind them one last time. The air grew colder as November settled over the town, the trees bare and skeletal against the gray sky. Ezekiel felt the chill in his bones, but it was nothing compared to the frost in his children's voices. They'd stopped pretending now, their visits more like inspections than conversations. Marcus measured doorways, muttering about accessibility issues. Lila cataloged furniture, her eyes lingering on antiques she claimed were sentimental. Thomas paced, his silence louder than ever, as if he sensed the shift in the air but couldn't name it. Ezekiel watched them, his heart a tangle of grief and determination. He'd raised them to be better than this, hadn't he? He remembered teaching Marcus to swing a hammer, showing Lila how to plant tulips, reading bedtime stories to Thomas. But those memories felt like relics, buried under years of distance and disappointment. Still, he held on to a flicker of hope, not for himself, but for them. Maybe the will would wake them up. Maybe it would break the spell of their greed. One evening, as rain battered the windows, Marcus arrived with a realtor. The man, slick in a cheap suit, wandered the house, jotting notes on a clipboard. "Great bones," he said, oblivious to Ezekiel's presence. "Could fetch a good price with some updates." Marcus nodded, avoiding his father's gaze. Ezekiel's voice cut through the room like a blade. "This house ain't for sale." The realtor froze, glancing at Marcus, who forced a laugh. "Dad, we're just exploring options. Nothing's decided." But Ezekiel saw the truth in his son's Aisa hunger that had nothing to do with family. He wheeled closer, his voice low but fierce. "You don't decide my home, Marcus. Not now. Not ever." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, ushering the realtor out. Alone again, Ezekiel felt the weight of the moment. He wasn't just fighting for his house. He was fighting for his dignity, for the life he'd built brick by brick. He thought of Clara, her hands calloused from gardening, her laughter a melody that held the family together. She believed in their children, even when they faltered. Ezekiel wanted to believe, too, but the evidence was stacked against them. The day of the will reading loomed closer, a storm gathering on the horizon. Ezekiel spent his days preparing, his mind sharp despite his body's frailty. He called Mr. Hargrove daily, ensuring every detail was perfect. The lawyer, sensing the gravity of Ezekiel's plan, spoke carefully. "They'll be there," he said. "All three. I've sent the letters." Ezekiel nodded, picturing the scene. The dining room, the same table where they'd once shared Christmas dinners, would become a courtroom. He didn't relish their pain, but he couldn't spare them the truth. They'd built their lives on lies about him, about what they deserved, about what family meant. The will would strip those lies away. One night, Thomas came alone, a rare occurrence. He sat across from Ezekiel, his hands fidgeting. "Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you okay?" "Really?" Ezekiel studied his youngest son, searching for sincerity. Thomas had always been the quiet one, the one who followed rather than led. But there was something in his eyes tonight, a flicker of guilt, maybe even regret. "I'm as okay as I need to be," Ezekiel said, his tone softer than usual. "What about you, son? You okay with all this?" He gestured vaguely, encompassing the house, the family, the unspoken plans. Thomas looked away, his shoulders hunching. "I don't know," he mumbled. "It's just complicated." Ezekiel waited, hoping for more, but Thomas stood abruptly, muttering about work and leaving before the silence grew too heavy. Ezekiel stared at the empty chair, his heart twisting. Thomas was the closest to breaking, the one who might still feel the pull of family. But feeling wasn't enough. Action was. And Ezekiel had seen too little of that from any of them. The next day, Lila called, her voice bright with forced cheer. "Dad, I was thinking we could have a family dinner before. You know, any big decisions. Like old times." Ezekiel almost laughed. Like old times. There'd been no family dinners since Clara died. No warmth to rekindle. But he agreed, curious to see their next move. The dinner was a farce. Marcus dominated, talking over everyone, his plans for the house spilling out between bites of store-bought lasagna. Lila played the peacemaker, her smiles brittle. Thomas barely ate, his eyes fixed on his plate. Ezekiel watched them, his silence louder than their chatter. They thought they were pulling the strings, but the stage was his. As they left, Marcus lingered, his hand on the doorknob. "We're doing this for you, Dad," he said, almost convincing himself. Ezekiel met his gaze, unblinking. "No, Marcus, you're doing it for you." The words hung in the air, a challenge neither could ignore. Marcus left without another word, and Ezekiel wheeled to the study, his hand steady as he opened the locked box. The will waited, its pages heavy with purpose. 1 week left. 1 week until the truth came crashing down. The final week before the will reading passed in a blur of tension and quiet defiance. Ezekiel felt the house closing in, its walls whispering memories of better days. He spent hours in the study, surrounded by Clara's books and his old journals, grounding himself in the life he'd lived. The children's visits grew more frequent, each one a performance. Marcus's bluster, Lila's crocodile tears, Thomas's nervous glances. They thought they were wearing him down, but Ezekiel was a rock, weathered but unyielding. He began to notice small things missing. A silver candlestick from the dining room, a porcelain figurine Clara had loved. He didn't confront them. He didn't need to. Their greed was a confession. written in every pilfered trinket. Ezekiel's heart ached, not for the objects, but for what they revealed. His children weren't just distant, they were thieves, stealing pieces of his life while he still breathed. One afternoon, Mr. Hargrove visited, his briefcase heavy with the weight of Ezekiel's decision. They sat in the study, the air thick with unspoken questions. "Everything's ready," Hargrove said, adjusting his glasses. "The notary will be there. Neutral ground, as you requested. The community center, Friday at noon." Ezekiel nodded, his fingers tracing the edge of the locked box. "They won't expect it," he said, more to himself than to Hargrove. The lawyer hesitated, then spoke softly. "You could still change it, Ezekiel. Give them a chance to make things right." Ezekiel's eyes hardened. They've had chances. Years of them. This isn't about punishment. It's about what's true. Hargrove sighed, nodding. He left Ezekiel alone with his thoughts, the ticking clock a reminder of the days slipping away. That night, Ezekiel dreamed of Clara. She stood in the garden, her hands dusted with soil, her smile bright as the sun. "You're doing the right thing," she said, her voice clear as a bell. When he woke, tears stung his eyes, but his resolve was stronger than ever. Clara had always believed in justice, in love tempered with truth. He would honor her, even if it meant breaking their children's hearts. The day before the reading, Marcus arrived with a lawyer of his own, a sharp-eyed woman who spoke in clipped tones about estate planning and best interests. Ezekiel listened, his face impassive. As they outlined their vision, the house sold. Ezekiel in a facility. The proceeds split evenly. "It's practical," Marcus said, leaning forward. "You don't want to be a burden, do you?" The word burden hit like a slap, echoing his cruel words from years ago. Ezekiel's voice was calm, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. "I've never been a burden, Marcus. I carried you all when you couldn't walk. Don't forget that." The lawyer shifted uncomfortably, but Marcus pressed on, his voice rising. "You're being stubborn, Dad. You can't handle this place alone. We're trying to help." Ezekiel's gaze didn't waver. "Help yourselves, you mean?" "I see you, Marcus. I see all of you." The room fell silent, the truth a heavy fog between them. Marcus left with the lawyer, his face red with frustration. Ezekiel watched them go, his heart pounding. Tomorrow, it would all come to light. Tomorrow, they'd face the consequences of their choices. The morning of the reading dawned gray and cold, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. Ezekiel dressed carefully, choosing a suit he hadn't worn since Clara's funeral. It hung loosely on his frame, but it gave him a quiet dignity. He wheeled himself to the front door, where a van waited to take him to the community center. The driver, a young man with kind eyes, helped him in, chatting about the weather. Ezekiel nodded, his mind elsewhere. The community center was a modest building, its walls lined with posters for bake sales and book clubs. Inside, a small room had been set up with a table and chairs. Marcus, Lila, and Thomas were already there, their faces a mix of impatience and expectation. They barely acknowledged Ezekiel as he entered, their eyes fixed on Mr. Hargrove, who stood at the head of the table with a folder in hand. Ezekiel took his place, his wheelchair creaking softly. He looked at his children, searching for a trace of the people they'd been. Marcus's jaw was set, Lila's hands clasped tightly, Thomas's eyes darting to the door. They thought they knew what was coming. They thought they'd won. Mr. Hargrove cleared his throat, his voice steady. "We're here to read the last will and testament of Ezekiel James Thompson." The room stilled, the air thick with anticipation. Ezekiel closed his eyes for a moment, picturing Clara's face. This was for her. For them. For the truth. Hargrove began to read. his voice clear and deliberate. The first few paragraphs were standard debts settled, small bequests to local charities. The siblings shifted, their impatience growing. Then Hargrove paused, his eyes meeting Ezekiel's. And now, the distribution of the estate. The room seemed to shrink as Mr. Hargrove's voice carried the weight of Ezekiel's will. Marcus leaned forward, his fingers drumming on the table. Lila's smile was tight, her eyes gleaming with expectation. Thomas sat hunched, his hands gripping his knees. Ezekiel watched them, his heart a storm of sorrow and resolve. This was the moment he'd been building toward, the moment they'd face the mirror of their actions. Hargrove's voice was steady, each word a stone dropped into still water. To my children, Marcus, Lila, and Thomas, I leave the following, the family home, its contents, and my savings, to be held in trust. The siblings exchanged glances, their relief palpable. But Hargrove continued, his tone unwavering. This trust is to be managed by the Thompson Family Foundation, established for the benefit of the community. The air shifted, confusion rippling across their faces. Marcus's brow furrowed. Foundation? What foundation? Lila's smile faltered, her hands tightening. Thomas's eyes widened, a flicker of panic breaking through his usual silence. Hargrove pressed on. The Thompson Family Foundation will use the estate to fund programs for the elderly, particularly those without family support. The house will be converted into a community center, offering meals, companionship, and care. My children will have no direct access to the funds or property, as they have demonstrated an inability to honor the values this estate represents. The words landed like a thunderbolt. Marcus shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor. What the hell is this? You can't do this. Dad. That's our inheritance. Lila's face crumpled, her voice shaking. Dad, how could you? We're your family. Thomas stared at the table, his hands trembling, unable to meet Ezekiel's gaze. Ezekiel spoke, his voice calm but unyielding. You stopped being my family when you decided I was a burden. This house, this money, it's not yours to sell or squander. It's for the people who need it, the ones you forgot when you forgot me. Marcus's face reddened, his voice rising. You're punishing us. For what? Trying to take care of you. Ezekiel's eyes burned with quiet fire. Take care of me. You took my things. You took my dignity. You call me a cripple. Marcus. A burden. Don't pretend this is about care. Lila sobbed, her tears more anger than grief. You're being cruel. Dad. We made mistakes. But this is too much. Ezekiel shook his head, his voice softening but firm. It's not cruelty, Lila. It's truth. I gave you everything, love. A home, a chance to be better. You chose differently. Thomas finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't mean for it to be like this. Ezekiel looked at his youngest son, seeing the boy he'd once tucked into bed. I know, Thomas. But meaning isn't enough. You stood by while they tore me down. That's a choice, too. Hargrove cleared his throat, resuming. There is one provision. Each of you may petition the Foundation's board for a small stipend, provided you volunteer at the community center for 1 year. Your work will be evaluated by the board, not by me. This is your chance to earn back a piece of what you've lost, not in money, but in purpose. The room fell silent, the weight of Ezekiel's words settling over them. Marcus paced, muttering about lawsuits. Lila wiped her eyes, her face hardening. Thomas stared at his hands, lost in thought. Ezekiel watched them, his heart heavy but certain. He'd given them a chance, not to reclaim wealth, but to reclaim themselves. Hargrove gathered his papers, signaling the end of the reading. That concludes the will, he said, Any questions can be directed to my office. He glanced at Ezekiel, a silent acknowledgement of the storm he'd unleashed. Ezekiel nodded, his face unreadable. As the siblings filed out, their voices a mix of anger and disbelief, Ezekiel remained in the room, the silence wrapping around him like a blanket. He thought of Clara, of the life they'd built, of the values they'd tried to pass on. He'd done this for her, for the people who'd been forgotten like he had. But a part of him, a small, stubborn part, still hoped his children would find their way back. That night, Ezekiel returned to the house, its familiar creaks a comfort. He wheeled to the study, the locked box now empty, its purpose fulfilled. He picked up a photograph of his family, taken decades ago when laughter was easy and love was certain. His fingers traced their faces, lingering on Clara's smile. "I tried. Clara," he whispered. "I hope it's enough." The days after the will reading were quiet, the house emptier than ever. Ezekiel felt the weight of his decision, but also a strange lightness, as if he'd shed a burden he'd carried too long. The town buzzed with whispers. Neighbors, friends, even strangers had heard about the Thompson Family Foundation. Some called Ezekiel a hero. Others called him harsh. He didn't care. He'd done what was right, not for praise, but for the truth. Marcus didn't return. Ezekiel heard through a neighbor that he'd hired a lawyer, vowing to contest the will. But Hargrove had been thorough. The document was ironclad. Lila sent a letter, her words a mix of apologies and accusations, promising to fight for her share. Ezekiel read it once, then tucked it away. Thomas was the only one who came back, standing on the porch one rainy evening, his face pale and uncertain. "Dad," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to fix this." Ezekiel looked at his son, seeing the struggle in his eyes. "You start by showing up," he said. "Not for the money. For yourself." Thomas nodded, his shoulders slumping, and left without another word. Ezekiel watched him go, a flicker of hope stirring in his chest. The house was transformed in the months that followed. Volunteers arrived, turning the dining room into a gathering space, the garden into a community plot. Ezekiel stayed, not as a resident, but as a guide, his wheelchair a familiar sight as he shared stories of Clara's roses or the history of the house. The community center opened its doors, offering meals to the lonely, classes to the curious, a home to those who'd been forgotten. Ezekiel found purpose in the work, his days filled with faces that reminded him of his own struggles. An elderly woman named Ruth, who'd lost her family to time and distance, became a regular, her laughter a balm to Ezekiel's wounds. "You're a stubborn old goat," she told him one day, her eyes twinkling. "But you've got a good heart." Ezekiel smiled, his first real smile in years. One afternoon, as spring bloomed outside, Thomas returned. He didn't ask for money or forgiveness. Instead, he picked up a broom and started sweeping the community center's floor. Ezekiel watched, his heart swelling. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Lila appeared weeks later, her face softer, her hands stained with paint from helping with a mural. She didn't speak to Ezekiel, but her presence was enough. Marcus remained absent, his pride a wall too high to climb. Ezekiel didn't expect miracles. He knew some wounds never healed. Some lessons came too late. But he'd planted a seed, not just for his children, but for the community he'd chosen to serve. The Thompson Family Foundation grew, its impact rippling beyond the house, touching lives Ezekiel would never meet. On a quiet evening, as the sun set over the garden, Ezekiel sat by Clara's roses, their petals vibrant against the fading light. He felt her presence, not as a ghost, but as a warmth in his chest. "We did it," he whispered, his voice steady. "We showed them what matters." Ezekiel lived another year, his days filled with purpose, his nights with memories of Clara. When he passed, The community center closed for a day, its rooms filled with flowers and stories of the man who'd given everything. Marcus didn't come to the funeral, but Lila and Thomas did, their faces etched with grief and something new understanding. The house stood strong, no longer just a home, but a legacy. Ezekiel's will had done more than redistribute wealth. It had redistributed hope, reminding a fractured family and a lonely town what it meant to care. And in that, Ezekiel found peace. His final act a testament to a life well lived, a love well kept, and a truth fiercely defended.